Legalism versus God's law. Legalism is the belief that salvation or righteousness can be earned by strict adherence to laws or rituals. This is what Paul condemns in Galatians 5. You who are trying to be justified by the law have been severed from Christ. You have fallen away from grace. God's law, on the other hand, is described as holy, just good, and even a law of liberty. James 1:25. The problem arises when people try to use the law as a substitute for faith or grace. Why, some view the law as bondage, misreading Paul's letters. Paul warns against being under the law as a system of justification. Some interpret this as a rejection of all law, rather than a rejection of law as a means of salvation. Cultural resistance to obligation. As one commentary notes, many people define legalism as simply the belief that one is obligated to obey the law. And because the flesh resists submission, Romans 8:7, law-keeping is seen as a burden. Historical reaction to Pharisaic legalism. Jesus rebuked the Pharisees for their obsessive rule-keeping while neglecting justice, mercy, and faithfulness, Matthew 23:23-24. This led some to reject law entirely, rather than its misuse. What Scripture actually says, Galatians 5:1, it is for freedom that Christ has set us free. Stand firm then, and do not be encumbered once more by a yoke of slavery. Paul is warning against returning to a system of justification by law, not against the law itself. Romans 3:20. No one will be justified in his sight by works of the law, for the law merely brings awareness of sin. The law reveals sin, but cannot save. James 2:17. Faith by itself, if it does not result in action, is dead. True faith produces obedience, not legalism, but Spirit-led righteousness. Summary: legalism is bondage, trying to earn salvation through law. God's law is freedom, when embraced through faith and the Spirit. The confusion comes from misusing the law or rejecting it entirely rather than understanding its proper role. Bondage in the Bible, always linked to sin. John 8:34. Everyone who sins is a slave to sin. This is spiritual bondage, not a condemnation of God's law. Romans 6:16. We are either slaves to sin or slaves to righteousness. The law helps us choose righteousness. 2 Peter 2:19. People are slaves to whatever has mastered them. This refers to corruption and depravity, not God's commandments. Galatians 5:1. It is for freedom that Christ has set us free. Do not let yourselves be burdened again by a yoke of slavery. Paul warns against returning to legalism as a means of salvation, not against the law itself. God's law, described as good and liberating, Psalm 19:7. The law of Yahweh is perfect, refreshing the soul, Romans 7:12. So then the law is holy and the commandment is holy, righteous and good, James 1:25, refers to the perfect law that gives freedom. Is Paul's letters, especially Galatians and Romans, clarify that the law reveals sin but cannot save? Salvation comes through faith in Messiah, not through law-keeping. However, once saved, the law becomes a guide for righteous living, not a source of bondage. Summary: bondage equals sin and corruption, not obedience to God's law. God's law equals holy, good, and a path to freedom when embraced through faith. Misusing the law for self-righteousness or legalism can feel like bondage. But that's a distortion, not the law itself.